Hello, my name is Deborah Karata. Welcome to my course, Angular Reactive Forms from Pluralsight. Did you know that there are two different ways to create data entry forms in Angular? The template-driven approach uses HTML with two-way data binding. The reactive approach manages the form and its data in the component code. This course looks at the similarities and differences between the template-driven and reactive forms approaches, helping you decide the best technique to use for your team and your project. It details how to use the reactive forms approach, shifting the logic for the form from the HTML to the component code, giving you more flexibility and more control. It includes techniques such as watching for and reacting to user changes, and dynamically duplicating input elements, allowing you to build powerful and reactive forms. The course walks through validation scenarios, such as adjusting validation at runtime and custom and cross-field validation. And since forms display and save data, you'll learn how to send get, post, put, and delete requests to a web server using HTTP and observables. By the end of this course, you'll have the skills to build powerful and dynamic data entry forms using the reactive forms approach. I hope you'll join me on this journey through Angular Reactive Forms from Pluralsight. We can build forms in Angular with a template-driven approach using HTML and data binding. Or we can build reactive forms using a model-driven approach by defining the form model and validation in our component code. Welcome to Angular Reactive Forms from Pluralsight. My name is Deborah Karata, and this course provides the concepts you need to build reactive forms, validate user-entered data, and save that data using HTTP. We've all filled out our share of online forms. Register for an event, fill out a form. Make a dentist appointment, fill out a form. And often our company runs on online forms. Forms for tracking our time, forms for booking conference rooms, forms for managing inventory, and so on. In this introductory module, we start with a short overview of forms in Angular. We consider several suggestions for getting the most from this course. We explore the demo form and sample application that we will use in this course. And we look at the topics we'll cover in the remainder of this course. Okay then, let's get started. When we build a form with Angular, we always create a component class for the form logic and a template for the form's user interface. If the form updates data, the component class calls a service to retrieve existing data from a database or other data store on a server somewhere, and that data is displayed as default values on the form. We then collect user entries, validating the data as the user types. If needed, we display validation messages back to the user. When the user submits the form, the component class calls a service to pass the validated data back to the database or other data store on the server, and the user's entries or updates are saved. How do we build the template and component class for our forms? Angular provides two techniques for building forms, template-driven and reactive, previously called model-driven. Both techniques share the same basic concepts. But as its name implies, template-driven forms put the responsibility for the form squarely in the template, which we define with basic HTML and data binding. Reactive forms shift much of that responsibility to the component class. We still create the template with HTML, but we manage the data and validation in the component code. Let's take a high-level look at the strengths of each technique. There are many advantages to building forms using a template-driven approach. The template-driven technique is straightforward and easy to use, and it looks very familiar if you've built forms with Angular 1. Because template-driven forms rely heavily on two-way data binding, we don't have to write any code to copy the data to the input elements or track the user's entries. It's all handled automatically. Speaking of automatically, Angular also automatically tracks form and input element state. We can use this state information to determine when the form is invalid and disable the Save button, for example. With much more of the logic for our form in our class, reactive forms provide more flexibility. They handle more complex validation scenarios, such as changing validation based on a user selection or on the form state. Reactive forms do not use data binding, so the form cannot mutate our data model. The component code controls how to handle any changes to the data. Some developers prefer this immutability. Using reactive forms makes it easier to perform an action on a value change, such as transforming the value to uppercase or performing a partial lookup. We have access to reactive transformations, such as debounce time, to delay reacting to user input, and distinct until change to ignore values that are the same as previously processed values. Reactive forms make it easier to dynamically add input elements to the form, so we could allow the user to enter any number of addresses, for example. And since more of the logic and validation are in the code, not the template, some developers find that the logic is easier to unit test. There is no magic going on under the hood when you work with reactive forms. Everything is direct. There is no template between your code and your data structures. The primary issue with reactive forms, however, is that they require more code. Depending on your team, its experience, and its background, some of these factors may weigh more heavily than others. It is important to select the appropriate forms approach that works best for you and your team. To help you make that decision, we'll dive deeper into their similarities and differences and examine the code for both techniques in the next modules. For now, let's look at some tips for getting the most from this course. To get the most from this course, it is important that you know the basics of Angular. This means understanding Angular modules, components, templates, including binding, services, and basic routing. If you don't have the requisite knowledge, consider taking one of the introductory Angular courses, such as Angular Getting Started or Angular First Look. You do not need any prior knowledge of Angular forms. We'll cover what you need in this course. Another way to get the most from this course is to join the discussion. Thoughts, comments, or questions as you watch this course? Feel free to use the discussion tab. You can find the link to the discussion on the Pluralsight page for this course. Or follow me on Twitter. It would be great to hear about your experiences with reactive forms. There is also a blog post specifically for this course at the URL shown here. This post identifies common issues along with their solutions. If you have any problems with the code for the course, check here first. There may already be a solution posted. When building web applications, regardless of the technologies we use, there are lots of steps and places where things can go wrong. That's when a good checklist can come in. I'll present checklists at the end of many of the modules, and we'll use them as a brief review of what was covered in that module. Feel free to jump ahead to the checklist if you have any problems when coding along with the demos. And consider referencing these checklists as you start building your own Angular Forms applications. Coding along with the demos is another great way to get the most from this course. Though not required, it is often helpful to try out the presented code as you navigate through the course. To get you started, I've set up a public GitHub repository specifically for this course. It is called Angular Reactive Forms, and you can find it at this URL. The starter files for the Forms demo are here. You can use these files as a starting point if you want to code along with the demos. If you prefer to follow along with the completed demo form code, you can find that here. Toward the end of this course, we'll look at a form in the context of a more full-featured sample application. That sample application is here. If you are new to GitHub, simply click this button to download all of the code as a zip file. So what's in this code? Let's take a look. We start with this simple demo sign-up form built using the template-driven approach. We examine the code, then rebuild this form using the reactive forms approach to understand the key differences between the two techniques. Then we add more features such as custom validation, cross-field validation, and dynamic addition of multiple addresses. Later in this course, we'll examine a second reactive form in the context of a more full-featured Angular application. The sample application demonstrates routing to the form, including routing guards, and details the data access service to communicate with a backend server via HTTP to retrieve and save data. Let's see this sample application in action. Welcome to Acme Product Management. As its name implies, this application manages our company's current list of products. We'll use this application later in this course when we look at a reactive form in the context of a more full-featured application. This application may look familiar if you have seen the Angular Getting Started course here on Pluralsight. I've incorporated an edit form and add, edit, and delete operations into the sample application that was built in the Getting Started course. Here at the top is our menu for access to the key features of the application. In a real application, there may be more options here, but we want to focus on building a reactive form, so I've limited the application to basic functionality. Clicking on the product list option displays the product list page. From here, we can click the edit button to edit the product. Clicking on the product name navigates to the product detail page. We also have an edit button here. Clicking the edit button displays the reactive form for editing the selected product. Notice that each of the fields are populated with existing values. The user can edit product information or click delete to delete the product. If the user makes a mistake and breaks one of the validation rules, the application displays a validation error message, and the Save button is disabled. Let's enter a new product name. If the user tries to navigate away from the page, we have a routing guard to notify them of their unsaved changes. If the user wants more search tags for this product, they can click Add Tag. This dynamically duplicates the input elements, so the user can add any number of search tags. Clicking Save saves the product and returns to the product list page where we see our updated value. Clicking the Add Product option displays the same form, but initialized for entry of a new product. Notice that the save is disabled until the form values are valid. Once all of the data is valid, clicking the Save saves the new product and navigates back to the product list page. Here we see our new product. So that's the basics of the sample application that we'll look at later in this course. Now let's finish up this introductory module with a look at the outline for the remainder of this course. In this course, we start with a more detailed look at the similarities and differences between template-driven and reactive forms, including an examination of the building blocks that make up the form model. Next, we build a reactive form, first using the form model building blocks directly, and then using Form Builder to simplify the code. We add validation rules and error messages to validate the user's entries, including custom validation and cross-field validation. With reactive forms, we can adjust how a form works reactively based on user entries and selections. For example, based on a user selection, we can change the form's validation rules. We'll see how to watch for user changes and react to those changes. We'll also examine reactive transformations, such as debounce time. Sometimes a single entry is not enough. The user may need to enter multiple email addresses or multiple address blocks or multiple search tags. In that case, we can dynamically duplicate input elements. We'll see how to do that with reactive forms and form arrays. Then we switch gears a bit and examine a reactive form in the context of a more full-featured sample application. We'll look at techniques for routing to the form, setting up routing guards, and building reusable custom validation. In many scenarios, the key purpose of a form is to collect or edit data that is then stored in a database or other data store somewhere. To do that, we need to deal with CRUD, or create, read, update, and delete operations for retrieving and saving data to a backend server with HTTP. By the end of this course, we'll have a simple but fully operational Angular application that includes a reactive form with full CRUD support. You can use this application as a reference for your own development. Let's get started. To determine whether reactive forms is the right choice for your project and your team, it is important to understand your form options. Welcome back to Angular Reactive Forms from Pluralsight. My name is Deborah Kurata, and in this module, we lay the foundation for understanding reactive forms by looking at the similarities and differences between it and template-driven forms. Coffee or tea? Cash or credit? Paper or plastic? Right or left? We face many choices every day. And when it comes to building forms in Angular, our choice is whether to use a template-driven or reactive forms approach. In this module, we start with the Angular form building blocks used by both approaches, form group and form control. We see what they are and what they do. Next, we walk through the template syntax for both template-driven and reactive forms. Then we examine a simple template-driven form. Our focus is not on all the features of template-driven forms, but rather on understanding enough to compare it clearly with reactive forms. Lastly, we look at several complex form processing scenarios as a segue to reactive forms. Let's get started. One of the key uses of forms is for the user to enter data that we save somewhere. Say that we display a form to the user, like this form. We don't want to save data that is incomplete or invalid, so we validate the user's entries as needed. If the entered information is not valid, we indicate that to the user and display an appropriate validation error message. There are many ways to style invalid entries and display the validation message. This is the simple technique we will use. We also want to disable the Save button until the input elements contain valid data. To achieve all of this, we track the state of each input element and the state of the form itself. Angular has a set of predefined form and input element states. These states define whether the user has changed a value in an input element. If the value is unchanged, the state of the input element is pristine. Changed values have a state of dirty. If all input elements on a form are pristine, then the form itself is pristine. If any input element on the form is dirty, then the form state is dirty. A state and an array track validity. The input element state is valid if it passes all defined validation rules. The form itself is valid if all input elements on the form are valid. Validation errors are added to an errors collection. The key of each array element is the name of the validation rule associated with the error. These states define whether the user has visited an input element. A value of touched means the user has set focus into the input element and then left the input element. Untouched is set if the user has not set focus, then left the input element. A form is touched if any input element has been touched. These visited states are useful to prevent displaying the required validation error message until the user has had a chance to enter something. How do we track all of this state information? Luckily for us, Angular has building blocks that define a form model, which tracks all of this state, plus the value of each input element. These building blocks are used by both template-driven and reactive forms to track state and values. Form control tracks the value and state of an individual input element, such as an input box. Form group tracks the value and state of a group of form controls. A form itself is managed as a form group, because what is a form but a group of input elements whose state and value we wish to track together? But any group of input elements on a form can comprise a form group. We could group the input elements for a mailing address block, for example, and form groups themselves can be nested within other form groups. For clarity, I'll often refer to the forms form group as the root form group. These building blocks are actually classes provided when we work with Angular forms. Instances of these classes define the form model. I've mentioned the term form model several times now. What is a form model exactly? A form model is the data structure that represents the HTML form, and it looks like this. The structure of the form model reflects the form and input elements in the template. In most cases, each input element within the HTML form has a corresponding form control in the form model. Form model retains form state, such as dirty or valid. It retains the user's entries in its value property. As the user types into any input element on the form, the value property is changed accordingly. The form model also tracks all of the form controls and nested form groups within the form, along with their state and value. Don't confuse the form model with the data model that we use with data binding. We'll see both the data model and form model when we get to the demo. We use these properties